Hi, everyone. This is S.J. Thomason with Christian-Apologist.com, and I am here with Mark Charles, who is an author, a journalist, and even a former presidential candidate for the U.S. government in 2020. So just a recent presidential candidate running as an independent on the ticket. And so he made a little bit of a splash right there. And he wrote a book that's about unsettling truths. And it's really important that we get to know these unsettling truths. And it talks about some of the rather disturbing points in our history, American history especially focused, but some of the disturbing points in our history, some treaties that were broken, a number of other issues that our government unfortunately did to the Native American population. And a lot of us growing up tend to think of things such as the discoverers of the New World. I found this book in my library. But the true discoverers of the New World were people who discovered in, I think, around 10,000 BC. It was thousands of years before Christ even walked the world that other people came to this part of the world. And so Native Americans, I think, might have made their way over here, over the Bering Straits, thousands of years ago. And right now, so you have the European perspective that Europeans came over here and they actually discovered this land. And so Mark has written this really good book, Unsettling Truths. Let me just go ahead and share a link so you guys can go ahead and pick up a copy. Hold on one second. I'm going to show you this link. And then I'm going to go ahead and just turn it all over to him there it is, purchase a sign. So you can all see this. There it is. So it's Unsettling Truths. You can see right here. Mark, the ongoing dehumanizing legacy of the Doctrine of Discovery. And so something that we're going to want to get into. We're going to find out today exactly what the Doctrine of Discovery is, and we're going to find out what Mark's perspective is as a Navajo Indian. So or Navajo Native American. And actually, I'm going to ask him also to talk about, should people even refer to Native Americans as anything but Native American? Is it appropriate to refer to Native Americans as American Indians, which is used so many times? And so I'm going to ask him about that as well. So Mark, nice to meet you.
Well, thank you. It's good to be on with you today. Please let me introduce myself. So Yate, Mark Charles Yinishia, Sin Bake Dinet Initially, the Tohiglini Bashichin, Sin Bake Dinet Dashachedo Todachini Dashanella. In our Navajo culture, when we introduce ourselves, we always give our 4 clans. We're matrilineal as a people with our identities come from our mother's mother. And so my mother's mother is American of Dutch heritage, and that's why I say Tsin Bake Dene. Loosely translated, that means I'm from the wooden shoe people. My second clan, my father's mother, is Tohiglini, which is the waters that flow together. My third clan, my mother's father, is also Tsin Bake Dene. And then my fourth clan, my father's father, is Todachitni, and that's the Bitterwater clan. It's one of the original clans of our Navajo people. I also want to acknowledge I'm speaking to you today from what is now known as Washington, D.C. I moved here from the Navajo Nation with my family about 6 years ago. But these lands are the traditional lands of the Piscataway. And I want to honor the Piscataway as the indigenous hosts of these lands. I want to thank them for their stewardship of these lands. And I want to just publicly state how humbled I am to be living on these lands today.
Oh, that's wonderful. And so that's something that I think people don't talk about so much, but there were millions of Native Americans living in the 2 continents, the United States, South America, North America. Millions of Native Americans were living here when Christopher Columbus supposedly discovered America in 1492. And so what ended up happening was a lot of terrible violence and pushing people out of their lands and promising treaties that were unfulfilled. And so your book really explores that. And you also give your own perspective as someone who went and, as you said, lived. You've lived in the Native American areas. And so, what's your perspective? What do Native Americans think today should happen to sort of recompense or compensate them for some of the terrible parts of our history?
Well, that's a very complex question, and you'll get a lot of different answers depending on who you ask. So the book I co-authored, Unsettling Truths, the ongoing dehumanizing legacy of the Doctrine of Discovery. My co-author is actually, his name is Soong-Chan, and he's written several books. He's a professor. He was at North Park Seminary. He's actually moving to Southern California and will be a professor at Fuller Seminary this next year. One of his books is called Prophetic Lament. He's also written another book titled The Next Evangelicalism. And he and I partnered together on this book. And we had several goals with this book. The initial goal of the book was to call the church, the American church specifically, into a season of lament for its complicity in the doctrine of discovery. So the Doctrine of Discovery, it's essentially a series of papal bulls, edicts of the Catholic Church. They were written between 1452 and 1493. They say things like invade, search out, capture, vanquish, and subdue all Saracens and pagans whatsoever, reduce their persons to perpetual slavery, convert them to his and to their use and profit. It's essentially the church in Europe saying to the nations of Europe, wherever you go, whatever lands you find not ruled by white European Christian rulers, those people are subhuman and their land is yours to take. So this is literally the doctrine that let European nations go into Africa, colonize that continent, and enslave the people because they did not believe they were human. The first sentence of our book says you cannot discover lands already inhabited. You can steal those lands, you can conquer those lands, you can colonize those lands. You can't discover them unless your worldview tells you that the people living there are not fully human. And so this doctrine, not only does it come out of a very dysfunctionally diseased theological view of the Christian church, but it gets embedded into the foundations of our nation. So our Declaration of Independence, which starts with the words, we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal. 30 lines later, it refers to natives as merciless Indian savages, making it very clear they use this inclusive term all men because their definition of who is human was actually very narrow. The Constitution, which starts with the words, we the people, again, sounds inclusive. A few lines later, Article 1, Section 2, defining who's covered by this document, never mentions women, specifically excludes natives, counts Africans as 3/5 of a person. 1787, that literally left white men. That's who our Constitution was written to protect. White, technically landowners, were the ones who could vote, men. In 1823, the Supreme Court was deciding a case, Johnson versus McIntosh. This is the John Marshall Court. He's considered one of the greatest Supreme Court jurists in our nation's history. And he was, the case before him was Johnson versus McIntosh. It's two men of European descent litigating over a single piece of land. They had to decide who had the right to have the land. One man claimed they got it from the government. The other man claimed they got it from the native tribe. And they had to decide, the court had to decide who had the right to sell the land, the government or the tribe. So they rule that the principle for land titles is discovery. And then they go on to state that even though natives were here first, but because we're savages, we only have the right of occupancy to the land, while Europeans have the fee title, the right of discovery to the land, so therefore they are the true title holders. That case in 1823 helps create the legal precedent for land titles that gets referenced by the court in 1954 by name, 1985. Most recently in 2005, we have the Supreme Court referencing the Doctrine of Discovery and alluding to the fact that because natives are savages, they cannot rekindle embers of sovereignty over lands they lost long ago. And so these are the challenges we face as a nation. And the first 4 chapters of our book, the first 2 chapters kind of lay out this dysfunctional worldview and theological worldview. And then in chapters 3 and 4, we go very much in depth of how the Christian church, which started by Christ, based on the teachings of Jesus, how we got from his teachings, he said things like love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, how we got from there to a dehumanizing doctrine of discovery that literally said you can kill people who don't look like, worship like, act like, or speak like you. That journey in and of itself is fascinating. Again, that's chapters 3 and 4 of the book. And then we show how even the Protestant church, because initially they pushed back against the doctrine, there was a Catholic doctrine, but when they began landing here in this new world, and they wanted to claim their rights to it, they began taking very clearly, this is going back, starting with the sermon of John Winthrop in his sermon, A Model of Christian Charity, in 1630, and what's now known as the Boston Harbor. And he begins painting this picture of the colonists, Protestant Christians, were God's chosen people, and Turtle Island, North America, was their promised land. Once you establish that sort of worldview, that you're God's chosen people and these are your promised lands, you don't have to read very far into the books of Deuteronomy and Joshua to realize that your command by God then is to ethnically cleanse those lands. Right? In Joshua, God literally told, and Deuteronomy, he told the people of Israel to kill every man, woman, child, every animal, to leave nothing left alive. And that's exactly what Joshua did. So promised lands, if you're claiming the right to have promised lands, you are claiming a divine right to commit genocide. And this is so much a part of the American worldview, the American Christian worldview, that even in 2015, when Benjamin Netanyahu was here in the US and he was lobbying against President Obama and the nuclear deal that he was negotiating with Iran, and he was, against precedent, invited to speak, to lobby to a joint session of Congress. And the Congress back then in 2015, just like today, was extremely divided, barely even talking to each other. And he had to get everyone on the same page behind him. So in his early remarks, he said to our Congress, because America and Israel, we share a common destiny, the destiny of promised lands. See, the modern nation state of Israel and the nation of the United States of America have a very dysfunctional, codependent relationship that has very little to do with freedom, equality, or human rights. It's about claiming or co-opting this narrative of promised lands and using it to justify oppression and, in our case, even genocide. So the modern nation state of Israel needs, we need the modern nation state of Israel, Old Testament legacy of promised lands, to justify what we did to natives and African Americans. And the modern nation state of Israel needs our legacy of a land with a manifest destiny to justify what they're doing currently to Bedouins and to Palestinians. It's a very dysfunctional codependent relationship. It has very little to do with human rights or equality. It's all about justifying our mistreatment of people unlike these two nations living in the lands that both these people are claiming.
Yeah, very interesting history. And I like the fact that you've gone into and look at some of the political issues that are associated with as well, like the manifest destiny and the claims of the past. And one thing I definitely wanted to expand, or if you could expand on a little bit, are your views about the Christian church. Because one of the things that you pointed out, you said when they came over here, they thought that they could use this doctrine of discovery and try to pretend that other people weren't humans. I just want to do a little quick sidebar. That is the same way that people justify abortions. They say that the fetus is non-human, personhood's not conferred until some magical point during the pregnancy. They don't claim that life began at conception. So it's anti-scientific. But we also saw the Nazis claim that Jewish people were less than human. You saw the slaves also being claimed as less than human. So just like what Mark's saying, the Native Americans also were given this designation so people can justify their conscience, which tells us that's not right. Like your conscience knows that's not right to do that to another human. So to justify that in their minds and to appeal to get past their conscience, it's calling nagging them out, is to pretend that these people are less than human, which is really horrible. And so Mark, I wanted to say, when they came over here, what religion and what were the natives practicing? It tended to be, I know there's a lot of different tribes, so there's some variation, quite a bit of variation probably in language and practices, but what did they find? What kind of spiritual beliefs did the people hold prior to coming in? There were very
advanced spiritual beliefs. There were very advanced societies that were living here. There were nations, separate nations here. Treaties were being established amongst ourselves, as well as amongst the early colonizers who came here. They didn't, again, they claim to have discovered it, but you can't discover lands already inhabited. And so they didn't acknowledge the humanity of anyone who was already living here. And they said this was an empty land, and we have basically, with this notion of manifest destiny, God's right to ethnically cleanse it and to claim it for our own. And that's exactly what they did. Throughout the 19th century, this nation ethnically cleansed the continent. In fact, our Congress, the U.S. Congress, awards 425 medals of honor to U.S. soldiers who participated in the Indian war campaigns. Many of those medals were actually awarded for people participating in massacres. The Wounded Knee Massacre, 300 Dakota men, women, and children slaughtered in a single day. The U.S. Army awards 20 Congressional Medals of Honor to U.S. soldiers who participate in that. And even our greatest, the president that this nation claims to be their greatest president, Abraham Lincoln, he was, in 1862, he signed the Pacific Railway Act and a settlement act, a land settlement act. The settlement act allocated 160 acres to anyone willing to move west and homestead. It was the Homestead Act, and homestead for 5 years. And the Pacific Railway Act allocated land and resources to the railway companies to complete the Transcontinental Railway. Within 2.5 years of that, signing that bill, Abraham Lincoln had literally, after ethnically cleansing the state of Minnesota, the hanging of the Dakota 38, after the Bear River Massacre in Utah and Colorado, after the Sand Creek Massacre in southern and eastern Colorado, after the Long Walk of the Navajo and the Mescalero Apache in the territory of New Mexico, he has literally ethnically cleansed the routes of the three primary railway plans for the Transcontinental Railway. He was actively ethnically cleansing Native peoples in the territory of New Mexico, my people, the Navajo, Mescalero Apache, when he was assassinated in 1865.
Yeah,
I can only imagine how many lives were saved because he was assassinated. And
wow, yeah, that's amazing.
We have 2 chapters in our book deconstructing the mythological legacy of Abraham Lincoln. And in those chapters, we demonstrate how not only was he a genocidal ethnic cleansing president, he was also a blatant white supremacist. And he had very little value for the actual human life of anyone who is not white European. And we hold him up as our greatest president. In fact, if you read his Thanksgiving proclamation in 1863, and you compare it to the massacres and the removal that he had overseen, his administration had conducted in the 12 months prior, the Thanksgiving Day Proclamation of 1863, which is really the proclamation that brought Thanksgiving into the modern era, he was literally thanking God for the fruits of the genocide the United States of America was actively conducting in 1862 and 1863. This is how we point out, right? Because history is written by the victors and the United States of America has never lost a war that matters. Could you imagine, right, if Nazi Germany won World War II, how their history books would portray Adolf Hitler and how their history books would portray the Holocaust? Well, this is exactly how our history books portray Abraham Lincoln and exactly how our history books portray the ethnic cleansing of Native nations from this entire continent. We're no better morally or ethically than Nazi Germany. The only difference between us is we won our wars and they lost their wars. It's the only difference. And people, especially white Americans, don't know what to do with that. And so they hold up Abraham Lincoln for a mythological legacy when he literally was one of the most white supremacist and ethnic cleansing presidents in our nation's history.
That's a fact that, see, I read your book and I've also been of the opinion, I thought Abraham Lincoln was, just like you mentioned, our hero for making sure that we have no more slavery. And so I thought I had always viewed him in a positive light. And then I read your book and I realized his treatment towards Native Americans was anything but being heroic. And so I wanted to get a little bit into your beliefs, actually. I believe you're a Christian. And so you see a lot of fault with the church, and I do too, through history. And I also see some fault today. We unfortunately have some issues still going on. So how did you come to Christianity? And Or did you come to Christianity, or were you raised a Christian? I guess I should say.
So my father and my mother, my mother is American of Dutch heritage. My father's Navajo. My grandparents, on my mother's side, have always been involved in white evangelical churches. So the Christian Reformed Church is the church that my mother was a part of and the church I grew up in. My father's parents, my grandmother came to faith through the boarding schools. And the goal of the boarding schools was to kill the Indian to save the man. And so there was a forced assimilation of Native children by basically stealing them from their homes, putting them into military-style boarding schools run by both the government and the church. And the message was, you have to become Christian, which means you have to become like a white American. You have to give up your language, you have to give up your culture, you have to give up your understanding of what's sacred and what's even your religious beliefs, and you have to accept the Easter Bunny and Santa Claus. You have to become a white American. And so my grandparents were converted under that understanding. My grandfather was they were working as translators for some of the early missionaries in New Mexico. And the Christian Reformed Church was actively running a boarding school. They were actively committing cultural genocide against Native peoples in the territory of in New Mexico. And they established their boarding school in the early 1900s. It operated for almost 80 years. When I attended it in the 1970s and 80s, it was transforming from a boarding school to a day school. I was there as a boarding school student, or as a day school student, and I had friends there as a boarding school student, and frequently our experiences were vastly different. And so I grew up, I tell people I grew up in a Dutch ghetto on the edge of the Navajo Nation. And I grew up in a white evangelical church. I was raised a Christian. I would say I began to own my own faith. I began to own my faith when I went into college and became involved with InterVarsity and was a student leader in that group. And then after college, I began working with Native American Christian groups, first on the college campus and then eventually in churches. I received what's called my license to exhort within the Christian Reformed Church in the Southwest churches. And so I was preaching in churches around the reservation. And I was called in the early 2000s to pastor a church in Denver called the Christian Indian Center. It was through that church that I got introduced to a network of indigenous Christians from all over the world. Their network was called the World Christian Gathering on Indigenous Peoples. And it was indigenous Christians from all over the world who were meeting every 2 or 3 years in a different nation around the world to basically share stories and encouragements of how they were in the process of decolonizing their faith. Because Western Christianity didn't just colonize faith here in North America, they were doing it all over the globe. They were doing it in Australia, they were doing it in Africa, they were doing it in New Zealand, they were doing it in parts of Asia, they were doing it all over the globe. And so being a part of that network was a fascinating journey for me, where I got to meet different people and gain a much broader perspective of not only what the church is or who the church is, but what does it mean to actively follow Jesus. And then around the same time, we moved, after 2 years, we moved from Denver to the Navajo Nation. And we began, we were living in a very remote section of our reservation out in the middle of nowhere on a dirt road, 6 miles off the nearest paved road, no running water, no electricity. Our neighbors were rug weavers and shepherds. And my wife and my son and I were there for 3 years. And then we moved into another community on the Navajo Nation called Fort Defiance. Still lived on a dirt road, but we're a bit not as far off the grid over there. And we lived there for 8 years. And I began actually working very intentionally within the church to try and raise up this, this history of the Doctrine of Discovery. There's a Native leader, his name is George Erasmus, and he is from the Dene people in Canada. And he was a part of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in Canada that they had over their history of boarding schools. And one of the quotes that he used when he was writing about this was a quote that said, where common memory is lacking, where people do not share in the same past, there can be no real community. If you want to build community, the quote says, you must start by creating common memory. I love that quote. I think it's very appropriate because it gets to the heart of our nation's problem with race, which is we don't have a common memory. We have a white America, a white majority that remembers a mythological legacy of discovery and expansion, opportunity, and exceptionalism. And we have communities of color, other marginalized communities that have the lived experience of stolen lands and broken treaties, of slavery and Jim Crow laws, of Indian massacres, of internment camps, of segregation, mass incarceration, families being ripped apart at our borders. There's no common memory. And there's actually no point in American history where there was healthy relationship across racial lines. We've never had healthy relationship across the racial lines as a nation. And it's because we don't share this common memory. We don't understand our own past. And white America has gone through great lengths to overwrite their history and create this mythological history that they now teach in their schools. So the last two chapters of our book, chapters 11 and 12, are about what I call the trauma of white America, where we acknowledge and identify the trauma that people of color experience from being on the receiving end of the horrific violence of American and church history. But I also look at research by a psychologist named Rachel McNair, who identifies another trauma called perpetration-induced traumatic stress, which she says is like PTSD, except if PTSD afflicts the victim of a horrifying event, PITS would afflict the perpetrator, the person who caused it. They contained much of the same symptoms and look. It's just one afflicts the perpetrator, the other afflicts the victim. There's a complex version of PTSD that can actually be passed down generationally. And then there's a communal response to that, which is known as historical trauma. And so I hypothesize in the book that if PTSD has a multi-generational communal manifestation at a complex level that we see afflicting marginalized communities all over the world, it would make sense that PITS would also have a multi-generational communal manifestation at a complex level, which is the trauma that I observe is afflicting white Americans. They're not victims of trauma, but they're experiencing it because of the history that they're standing on, and that is actively benefiting them today. And so I interact with white Americans as another group of traumatized people, understanding that they are triggered, they have defense mechanisms, they go into shock and denial just as quickly, even sometimes more quickly than even communities of color do, because they are absolutely opposed to looking at or understanding or even teaching this history. And we see that now, whether it's with the whole debate over CRT or, everything else. It's like white America, white evangelicalism does not want to look back at its history. It does not want to hear stories coming from the mouths of people from the margins. It does not want to really look close at what it's actively doing and what it's standing on. This is one of the reasons I don't use the term, a lot of people talk about racial reconciliation, for example. I don't use that term. Racial reconciliation implies there was a previous harmony. That's not true. Race was actually, it's a human construct. God didn't create race. Race was a human construct. And in North America, that race, the concept of race, was constructed by white people as a way to oppress people of color. The black race was constructed through what's known as the one drop rule, saying if you have a single drop of African blood, you're black. And then the American Indian race was constructed through what's called the blood quantum rule, which says, you can breathe the native out of you. You're full, then half, then a quarter, eighth, a 16th, and then depending on who you marry, your nativeness is bred out of you. And these were constructed for different reasons, right? The black race, the white America wanted to multiply that race because they were those who were enslaved. They were the labor force. They wanted as many of them as possible. Meanwhile, the American Indian race, their myths said there was no one here. They had treaty obligations to Native peoples. They wanted as few of us as possible. So our race was constructed so we could be bred out of existence. That's racial reconciliation is a misnomer. I use the term actively, continually, of racial conciliation. If reconciliation perpetuates the myth, we used to be great, now we're not, racial conciliation gives us a more honest starting point. This thing has always been a mess. We're just trying to make it better.
Yeah, I like that. And I like the fact that you're sharing a lot of history. One thing I wanted to give people a glimpse of is a day in the life of a person living in the Navajo Nation. How would your day go in that? And also just going back to the boarding school, because we've seen now these boarding schools are being exposed up in Canada for all these bodies are being discovered, and nobody really knows how the boarding schools came up. I mean, how did this, because this is not just going way back to before our ancestors, people I can't say, somebody I didn't know, like in the 1800s, but now we're talking about stuff in modern history that people like you have experienced. So I wanted to see if you could share with us the day in the life and then a little bit on the boarding schools.
I did not experience the boarding school. I was never a boarding school student. My grandparents are both boarding school survivors. There are many other boarding school survivors, and their stories need to be heard. Canada has dealt more directly with their history of boarding schools through their TRC process. They got the idea from us. We really, it was Richard Pratt who kind of laid out his argument for why we should do boarding schools. This was in a speech he gave in 1892. And it was 2 years after the massacre at Wounded Knee. And white America was losing some of its stomach for outright genocide, but they still wanted our lands. And so they said, rather than blatantly killing them, let's forcibly assimilate them. And then they justified it by pointing to slavery. Richard Pratt said, if we look what happened to the African people living in our midst, we brought them from savagery and cannibalism in Africa to partial citizenship and being civilized in America. And how did we do this and so quickly? Through association. By allowing them to associate with members of the higher race, we made them English-speaking and civilized. So he's literally saying, because we actually blessed them, our enslavement of African people was a blessing for them because it allowed them to associate with us and therefore become like us. And he said, if that was an unintentional consequence of enslavement, imagine how much quicker it would happen if we intentionally did it through boarding schools, right? This is why assimilation is one of the core American values. And the American church does this to this day, right? How many churches around this country get their foot in global missions by doing what? Teaching English, bringing in microeconomies, right? They are going out and allowing these subhumans around the world to associate with these white Americans, and maybe they just might have the privilege of becoming more like them. This is how deeply embedded this diseased way of thinking has become into the American psyche, that we still use it actively in the way we do missions today. And so this is something that our nation, right, is not yet dealing with. I appreciate what Deb Haaland is doing and some of the focus that she is putting on this. I'm disappointed she's the president she's serving is not, he pretty much got elected by promising to maintain the status quo. And so he's not interested in making a lot of deep-seated changes. Neither party is very interested in making any sort of deep-seated changes. But I really appreciate what she's doing as Secretary of the Interior to bring about issues and discussions, whether it's on treaty rights or whether it's on care of the environment, whether it's on boarding schools and missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. I think there's a lot of things that she's working hard to bring to the forefront, and things that our nation needs to begin to talk about much more directly. As far as understanding life on an American Indian reservation, we lived on the Navajo Nation for 11 years. And for 3 years, we were in as I said earlier, this very remote section of the reservation. No running water, no electricity. We lived by candlelight. We had to haul our water. Lived in a one-room hogan the size of, a small bedroom, and dirt floor, log walls. When we moved there, we prepared ourselves to live off the grid, right? We prepared ourselves to live by candlelight, to haul our water, to cook over a camp stove or even an open fire. What we were not expecting was how intensely marginalized the Native American community is here in the United States. It literally felt like we dropped off the face of the earth. We quickly learned, one of the first observations I made after moving there for several months was that there are primarily two groups of non-natives who come to Indian reservations: those who come to give us charity and those who come to take our picture. And most frequently, they're the same group of people. And they have very little interest in getting to know us personally. We're the objects of their charity, and we're the source of their learning. But they don't really want to know us as people, and they definitely don't want to deal with the history that left us in this place. When I first moved there, I was trying to sort through these feelings of being marginalized, as well as this history of the Doctrine of Discovery, and the fact that we basically only saw white people when they were giving us a charity or taking our picture. And I was wrestling with these emotions with some of my non-native friends as I was talking with them over the phone or even over email. And every time this history or the subject came up, I could feel sort of the emotions rising up in me. And I knew I had to guard myself, because if I wasn't careful, I could become very angry and might even misspeak or yell at my friends. And eventually I'd have to hang up the phone because I was holding in so many emotions. So I learned to kind of talk about these things in a way that disconnected myself from the reality. I talked about it like I read it in the newspaper, so then I could stay engaged longer. But then it was my friends who would get defensive. Well, my family didn't do that to your people. We weren't involved in that. And soon they would hang up the phone. And I didn't know how to initiate a conversation that allowed me to adequately articulate what I was feeling, but do it in a way that drew people into the dialogue. And one day I was writing a letter to my friends. This is the 10th time about trying to get them to understand what I was feeling. And I said, being Native and living in the United States, it feels like our Native community is this old grandmother who has a very large and a very beautiful house. And years ago, some people came into our house and they locked us upstairs in the bedroom. Today, our house is full of people. They're sitting on our furniture. They're eating our food. They're having a party inside our house. They've since come upstairs and they've unlocked the door to our bedroom, but it's much later. We're tired, we're old, we're weak, we're sick, so we can't or we don't come out. But the thing that hurts us the most, that causes us the most pain, is that virtually nobody from this party ever comes upstairs, seeks out the grandmother in the bedroom, sits down next to her on the bed, takes her hand, and simply says, thank you. Thank you for letting us be in your house. See, one of the challenges we face as a nation is that we have a massive reversal of roles. We have 300 plus million undocumented immigrants, most of them white and from Europe. They've never asked for, nor have they ever been given permission to be here. And they're living here like they own the place. Meanwhile, we have about 6 million indigenous peoples, Native peoples, who've been pushed aside to unwanted strips of land off on the margins. And we're being treated like unwanted guests in someone else's house. We have to reverse those roles. I was out sheep herding one day with one of the men on the sheep camp where I was. This is in the early 2000s. And the nation, George Bush was in office, and the nation was beginning to discuss immigration reform. And I said to my friend, who is a boarding school survivor, spent most of his life on the reservation, speaks better Navajo than English. I said to him, the whole country is talking about immigration reform. What's your thoughts? He said, well, there's already enough of them here. Maybe we don't need to worry about borders anymore. Now, if you're anywhere else, you assume he's talking about the 14 million undocumented who've come over the southern border. But because we're on the reservation, because he's a boarding school survivor, because we're both Navajo, you have to pause and ask, is he talking about the 14 million or the 300 million undocumented who've been pouring over this border since 1492? And I love the ambiguity so much I didn't even ask him to clarify. I just left it there. And I began teaching and writing and telling people that without Native peoples at the table, the United States of America is incapable of comprehensively and justly reforming immigration law. Without natives at the table, all we have is one generation of undocumented immigrants trying to figure out what to do with another generation of undocumented immigrants, and there's no integrity in the dialogue. It doesn't matter if you're building a wall to keep people out or tearing one down to let people in. If you don't have natives, Native Americans, the indigenous peoples of this land in the center of your conversation, you don't have the integrity or the authority to do either. This is the challenge we face as a nation. We have a reversal of roles. We need white Americans, especially, to understand in some very real and practical ways that they are guests in someone else's house. And I want indigenous peoples to understand in some very real and practical ways that we are the host people of this land. And we have to step in more fully to our role as the hosts.
That's fascinating, because I've had a couple people in the chat ask, what's the end game? Where do you see? And I think you're getting at that right now. You're getting at, a lot of times people talk about, here's what it is. Here's the situation we're in right now. And then the next question is, how should it be? How ought it to be? And so you're kind of touching on how it ought to be. And you're in a really difficult place. It's like a dinghy trying to pull a cruise ship, because you've got 6 million people versus, like you mentioned, over 300 million people. So there's and I shouldn't say versus, but I just mean I'm trying to get at how can we fix, like, what steps do we need to take today? Do we need to just work with the Department of the Interior, as you mentioned, and to make sure that people are recognized, or what do we need to do?
Well, so this is where I go back to the quote I shared earlier about common memory, right? And this is where I also go back to in the final 2 chapters of my book, and in the conclusion, I lay out some of my vision. My goal is that the United States of America needs a national dialogue on race, gender, and class. It's a conversation I would put on par with the Truth and Reconciliation Commissions that happened in South Africa and Rwanda and in Canada. However, as I said earlier, I would not call ours Truth and Reconciliation, because reconciliation implies there was a previous harmony. So I would call ours Truth and Conciliation. And I'm so convinced we need one sooner rather than later. I ran for president in 2020, and that was at the center plank of my platform. My vision was to build a nation where we, the people, for the very first time, truly means all the people. And this national dialogue was the center point of my platform. I had a 100-day plan to remove the racism, the sexism, and the white supremacy from our foundations. And my goal was to teach this history, create this common memory, because right now, the trauma of white America, the shock and denial of white America regarding the history they are standing on is so deep that they cannot even begin to have this, to work on this type of healing. Our book, which started out as a call to lament for the American church, after the 2016 election, we transformed it, we changed it into a flat-out rebuke of white evangelicalism. One of the conclusions I have in the book, one of the statements I make at the end of the book, is in its current state, the American church is incapable of bringing the type of healing that our nation needs. Because in its current state, both the left and the right is so deeply immersed in this understanding of we are God's chosen people and these are our promised lands, that the only solution they will offer up is we have to reinforce or reaffirm that identity. Right after I do a video series on my YouTube channel and my Facebook page. It's called My Second Cup of Coffee, and I address things going on in the church, things going on politically, things going on in the world and the country as I drink my second cup of coffee. And after the January 6th terrorist attack on our U.S. Capitol, I did a second cup of coffee, and I said in that video, I said, I'm fully expecting this Sunday that most churches in this country will either read from, preach on, or reference 2 Chronicles 7. What does that passage say? If my people who are called by my name will humble themselves and pray and turn from their wicked ways, I will hear from heaven, I will forgive their sins, and I will what? Heal their land. And I was right. Even conversations I was in, and because this is what Western Christianity clings to when it has crisis at a national level. And almost every church in this nation has prayed that passage at one point or another. What they don't acknowledge is that quote was given at the dedication of the temple. And God's reiterating the land covenant. As much as I'm sure God would appreciate the American church confessing its sin and turning from its wicked ways, there is nothing in Scripture that says God will heal their land. Hey, first of all, this isn't their land. They stole it. They stole it. And second, Jesus changed that entire barometer. The land covenant of Old Testament Israel was based on a barometer of prosperity. The people of Israel knew they were doing well with God based on their prosperity. If their borders were strong, if their walls were strong, if they were well fed and their families were healthy, if they were doing good, they knew if they were prospering, they had a good sense that they were doing well with God. If they were exiled, if they were hungry, if they were being run over by their enemies, they knew that something was amiss in their relationship with God. It wasn't the only barometer, it was one of their barometers. And Jesus, in the Sermon on the Mount, said, "Blessed are you not when you prosper, when you're persecuted. You will know you are doing well in your discipleship, not when you are wealthy and prosperous and well-fed, but when people do all sorts of evil to you because of my name." Now, the disciples didn't like that idea. The people following didn't like that idea. Peter rebelled against that, right? No one liked that idea. They didn't like that barometer. But that's what Jesus gave them. And
that's
so
true.
What we have is the church, and in our book, chapters 3 and 4, we trace it actually back to the writings of Eusebius in his book Ecclesiastical History, and then the conversion of Constantine, where the church completely throws off its the Christ incentivized barometer of persecution, and they re-embrace this barometer of prosperity, and they create a Christian empire, Christendom. And it's been downhill since then. And so this is where, when the American church reads the Old Testament and puts themselves in the place of Israel and says, God will honor us and God will bless us and God will do to us as he did to Israel, they are completely forgetting about the teachings of Jesus. They are completely throwing out the barometer that he gave his disciples. They are rejecting his teachings where he said, my kingdom is not of this earth. And so this is not a partisan or even a liberal versus conservative viewpoint. This is what American Christianity believes. And so our book flat out rebukes that, calls it out, and says in its current form, the difference between Democrats versus Republicans, liberal Christians versus conservative Christians, is not a difference between racism and anti-racism or equality versus inequality. It's a difference between implicit and explicit. If Donald Trump is saying make America great again, and Joe Biden is saying restore the soul of America, they're both saying what this nation was years ago was great. And we just have to go back to that. This is what they're saying.
Well, let me just come in here and ask something, because I'm just thinking about something that has. I went to Florida State. I live in Florida, and I'm a Florida State Seminole, and so you know that the name after the Seminoles. Seminoles are very well known down here as the Seminole casino owners, and according to the newspapers, it portrays them as being very wealthy because they have a monthly check. Each Seminole makes in the thousands apparently each month based on casino revenues, which are quite huge apparently, and so then because of that, I always had the perception that maybe Native Americans are doing much better financially than some of their peers who are in the same states. And so I looked up other American Indians or Native Americans. I looked up other groups to see if there was anything similar to that, and I couldn't find anything similar to that. And so I'm just wondering if you knew about that, or if there's a relationship that you know with casinos or any of that kind of stuff.
Well, casino and gaming is one of the ways that Native tribes have found a loophole in federal law that they can actually, it's a way for Native tribes to raise revenue. Because of the Doctrine of Discovery, because of the very parental relationship that the U.S. government has with Native tribes, we actually don't own our reservation lands. Our reservation lands are held in trust for us by the U.S. government. We don't own them. We can't buy them and sell them. We can't profit or generate revenue from them. They're held in trust by the U.S. government. And so this makes raising capital, or even just creating an economic center, very difficult for Native nations all around this country. And so gaming has been one way that Native nations have been able to raise revenue. And Native nations are actually much more communal than the hyper-individualism of Western Christianity and Western culture. And so a lot of times the money they raise from gaming will go into communal things like language preservation, like investing in the community, and even giving out a per cap, some sort of check on a per cap basis. So there are some tribes that do very well with that, but that's not the experience of most tribes around the country. Okay. And so where I live on the Navajo Nation, we didn't get gaming until just maybe about a decade ago, I think. I forget exactly how long ago. We were kind of late to that game. But even when I was living there, we were living in this remote section, no infrastructure, no running water, no electricity. I was there during the Great Recession. We didn't even talk about the Great Recession on our nation because we had 50% unemployment during a good year.
Wow. The
12 to 15% the nation was struggling with would have been a blessing for us, right? And so most people are on fixed incomes. There's this perception of people, they see a casino and those natives just have everything, but that's not the reality. And most of our Native communities are living in very impoverished situations. But there's not only that, there's also the history, all the historical trauma that our nations are wrestling with the blatant outright genocide as well as the cultural genocide that's been waged against our communities for 500 years. And so those are some things that most people do not factor in. But yeah, I don't know the exact situation of the Seminoles. I know they have a very large gaming facility. I know they've invested their money in a lot of different industries down there. I don't know the exact what's going on with their individual tribal members, but I do know that they have a fairly large enterprise going on their lands.
Yeah, that's what, well, my dad likes to gamble. At least he did before COVID, and so he frequents those facilities
Yeah.
and which is. But anyway, I also wanted to say something that you just touched on, and then we don't have too much time left. I know that I'm taking your time, and we're almost at an hour. But I also wanted to ask you a little bit that you just mentioned this hyper individualism, because you're right. The studies, this is what I study. I'm a college professor, and one of the studies that I focus on is cross-cultural values and variations and things like that. And one of the things that they found in all of these cross-cultural studies is in the United States, we have the highest levels of individualism in the world versus the idea of collectivism that you find in some other places. And so it sounds to me like the Native American population is more communal. And from other studies that I've seen actually of the Native Americans in the center, like right around Arizona area, I saw this study from the mid 1950s where people were, they distinguished one of the ways that Native Americans focus more on being in harmony with nature versus this idea that we can master nature. And I'm just wondering if that, because I wonder what you think of things like seeing Elon Musk and all of these people pretend like we can go colonize Mars or take over the world. I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts on that sort of thing, harmony versus mastery.
Yeah, I think the best way to address that is actually with the intro I give to the book here, where I talk about what I call one of the most significant, life-changing spiritual disciplines I've had, and that's the discipline of watching the sunrise. When I moved back to the Navajo Nation, I would, our people for centuries, for generations, rise before dawn, go out to the east, and greet this morning sunrise with our prayers. And so I began watching the sunrise every morning when I moved to the reservation. And it's one thing, right, when you go out on Easter morning and you watch the sunrise service, and maybe you have an early flight a few months later, you see another sunrise. It's always kind of catches your breath if you pause to look at it, and it's always beautiful. But after doing it day after day, week after week, month after month, and eventually year after year, I began to realize how much that experience was transforming me. As I saw the leaves change and the grass grow and the seasons change and the birds migrate and the animals come and go and the snow and the rain and the wind and all of these things, these processes that Creator had put in place. And I saw this happen season after season, week after week, month after month, year after year. It began to strike me how little control we actually have as people. Right? The sunrise is something that it happens, whether it's behind a cloud, whether it's behind a building, whether you're there to see it or not. There's nothing you can do to make it come quicker, and there's nothing you can do to make it last longer. It happens. We cannot control it. And not only is Western culture hyper-individualistic, it has this worldview that I would actually argue is rooted some in our time perception. We have a linear perception of time that we work out in schedules. And one of the results of a scheduled-based linear time perception is that you feel like you can control things. Native cultures, most of us, our people, have a circular perception of time. There's no starting, there's no ending point. You don't base your day on a schedule, you base it on the completion of tasks. And so in a linear time perception, you're hyper worried about, am I going to make it? Because if you miss it, it's gone. You can't get it back. If you miss something in a circular perception of time, you don't worry about it because it's going to come around again. Just two very different worldviews. But one, the linear schedule-based time perception lends itself to this perception that you can control things. And the circular perception of time gives you actually makes you very aware of how little control you have. And so I realized that by watching the sunrise, it was becoming and this was, again, this didn't happen quickly. This happened years. I did this for 11 years. In fact, I'm still doing it today here in Washington, D.C. I go to Potomac several mornings a week, and I actually watch the sunrise, and I film the sunrise and share it on my social media. But when you do it, the thing that started hitting me so strongly after several years was how little I was in control. And I actually began to find peace in being reminded that I wasn't in control. Right? So much about the anxiety of Western culture comes from when you feel out of control. Why does weather freak out Western cultures more than anything else? Because they can't control it. Right? If we can't control it and we can't sell insurance for it, we don't know what to do. And so there's this real, Western culture has this incessant need to control everything. And watching the sunrise became not only a great reminder I wasn't in control, but it actually allowed me to feel peace at remembering that I wasn't in control, and reduce my anxiety by a massive amount, because I wasn't trying to control things that I can't control. And I shared that at the beginning of this book for the very intentional reason of, if we're going to ever address something as massive, as historic, and as systemic as the doctrine of discovery, we're going to have to realize that we can't control it. We can't control that dialogue. We can't control the outcome. We can't control what's going to happen in this process. It's too big. It's too systemic. It's been going on for too long that if we're going to say I have a predetermined outcome, I mean, there's always goals we're aiming for. But if we're trying to control it, we're never going to get started, because we will never have everything in place to control it, to make it happen in the first place. And so I put that in the book as a reminder to people that we can't control it. And after the presidential election, I actually didn't watch the sunrise for about 4 or 5 years after we moved to DC, because it was harder to find the horizon here. We're kind of in the midst of a concrete jungle, and there was no easy place to get to each morning where I could watch the sunrise. But after I finished my campaign for president in 2020, and I heard the resounding declaration of this country that it didn't want to deal with its history, and I began pondering, what do I do next? How do I continue to work to initiate these dialogues, to teach this history, to build this common memory, to create this national dialogue? And I realized I needed to be reminded, again, that I'm not in control, and I needed to watch the sunrise again. But I also realized that I think one of the challenges our nation feels is still trying to control everything. And so I started watching the sunrise, not only for the personal benefit of reminding myself I'm not in control, but as a way to even invite and even disciple our nation into building an understanding, gaining an understanding that it's also not in control. So I live stream my sunrises 3 or 4 mornings a week. It's on my YouTube channel. It's on my Facebook page and on my Instagram. And I'm doing it as a way to see if we can actually begin to change the paradigm of our nation, so that we might be able to have these conversations that we desperately need to have. People are just too afraid to actually have them.
Yeah, I love that you actually, I remember the beginning of your book. I read your book just a couple of weeks ago, but I remember the beginning, and that did catch my attention, because I have such an appreciation for nature. I absolutely love nature, but you've touched on something really important also that I talk about in my classes. Time is of the essence. Time is money. You're wasting my time. I mean, we have this hyper focus on time. And I teach my students, I'm saying, this is not how it is in all of these other nations of the world. In fact, US and Germany and Austria tend to be insanely hyper focused on time, versus most other places are not nearly as they are at our extreme in New York City. So it's, I never heard of the idea, because I actually think about linear time. I talk about that a lot, but I've never heard of the way that you've put it in this sort of circular and completing tasks, and that you can go back. And I love that. That's fascinating stuff.
Yeah.
So,
one thing I point out to people frequently, I've done some study on this as an undergrad, and I actually did some, I presented a paper at the APA several years ago on some initial research we did on time perception. But one of the things I remind people is it's a time perception. There is no time truth, right? We all have a time perception. And the challenge is people don't think they have a time perception. They think they have a time truth. And so we tend to judge other people based on what we understand, what we believe the truth of time is, as compared to acknowledging I have a time perception. Other cultures, other peoples have a different time perception, which leads to a different set of values or a different worldview or different understanding of the way things run or come together. And so again, when you tie the hyper individualism, the cultural arrogance and colonialism of Western culture, and its the way it's obsessed with linear time,
and true.
Linear time perception, it creates this world where people literally think, well, that's the way time is, and that's not true. Linear time is a perception. It's not a truth. And I have the hardest time convincing Americans of that.
No, I can understand that. So I just, Mark, this has been so eye-opening, and I'm glad that we can get the word out. I know that I see some people in the audience who've made some comments, some positive comments on reaching across the aisle and trying to understand everyone's other points of view. And I like the fact that you're sharing quite a bit that a lot of people don't know. I think that the boarding schools, for example, that's recent history. The stuff that you mentioned that's happening in the 2000s. I mean, this is right now. A lot of so as you said, there has to be a dialogue. There has to be conversations. People need to, like you, somehow should get into government. And I mean, one of the reasons that I think that, or one of the things that I notice a lot of Jewish people have done since the Holocaust is number one, my son took a Holocaust elective in high school. This is something that's out in the public schools being shared quite a bit. And a lot of Jewish people got into the media, got into government, got into politics, got into, they're actors, actresses, and they've made it very clear to let us know, hey, this is what happened, so that it's never repeated. You'll repeat history if you don't understand history. And so I think that maybe encouraging Native Americans also to get involved in political positions and those kind of things, and trying to make an awareness. I think that's super important.
Yeah, I encourage people, if you want to get a copy of my book, you can get signed copies on my website, which is wirelesshogan.com, wirelesshogan.com. I also gave a TEDx talk about a year and a half, almost 2 years ago, called We the People, the 3 Most Misunderstood Words in U.S. History. You can search that on TEDx. It was a TEDx. It's also on the TED website, so you can find it there. And I have a lot of resources online. I have a very active YouTube channel. I have a very active IGTV. I'm very active on Facebook and Twitter. And so you can find me. I'm Wireless Hogan. Almost any social media out there, I'm under Wireless Hogan. I'm doing everything I can to teach this history, to create this common memory, to engage and try to initiate this dialogue. And, we'll see. I ran for president in 2020. The jury's still out in 2024, but I'm doing everything I can to make sure our country wrestles with its history.
Yeah, and also you might even consider, maybe, do you do any sort of political offices at a more local level or a state level? Have you thought about that?
I've debated that. One of the things that I'm fairly convinced of is politics is a cesspool and it's corrupting. And while one of the strategies is to kind of climb the ladder, but the longer you climb the ladder, that means the longer you have to stay in the cesspool, and the more easy it is to become corrupt. And so, and plus the changes that I want to see happen, while I don't discourage anyone from running for local office and from being engaged at that level, I just don't want to use that as a pathway to climb all the way to the presidency, because you have to scratch so many backs and make so many promises that by the time you get to where you want to be, you now have basically negotiated or signed away your right to actually fully advocate for the things you really want. And so and the changes I want to make, the role that I feel I want to play is I want to initiate these at a national level. That doesn't mean they don't need to happen at a local level. They don't need to happen at a state level. And there are many people who are willing to engage at those levels. Bless them. I highly encourage people to engage politically. I'm trying to bring it at the national level. And I'm doing it as an independent because I'm convinced one of the primary roles of the two-party system is to maintain the status quo. And so I'm running as an independent. People always said, well, you ran as an independent. Are you just a protest candidate? I'm like, no, if I wanted to be a protest candidate, I would have done what Bernie did, which is run as a Democrat, right? There's no way I ever would have won. I could have raised more money, been in more debates, but there's no way the Democratic Party would have ever nominated me. And so I ran as an independent. Yes, it was the hardest route to get to the White House, but it's the only route that actually gave me a chance of getting there. And so, you know, and the same is very much true for the Republican Party, you know, that they're just as intent on maintaining the status quo as the Democrats are, and they actually work together pretty well, including Donald Trump and Joe Biden. They work together pretty well at those goals. They scream at each other publicly, but the goals they're fighting for are actually not too far distant from each other.
That's interesting. And I your perspective on why against the local, that makes a lot of sense, because I look at lifelong politicians with kind of a little bit of a sneer, I have to say, because I think, how many, like you said, how many backs have you been tapping all the way up to top?
When I was running, I don't have the stats in front of me, but I remember I did some research, right? Because during the pandemic, we had a lot of differing opinions on what we had to do nationally to address issues, and so on and so forth. And I was looking at why is there such a hesitancy to address these kind of very strongly and forcefully. And I realized that the majority of our political leaders, people leading the parties in the House, the Senate, and the White House, this is true with Trump and Biden, almost all of them had been in political office, and then this wasn't Trump as much, but everyone else had been in political office since like the 1980s and 90s.
Yes, true.
Right? So Nancy Pelosi, Chuck Schumer, Mitch McConnell, Joe Biden, all of them, right? They've all been in office since the 80s or 90s. And so this means during all these crises that we faced, the Great Recession and all these things that we've faced as a nation, they never once felt income insecurity, food insecurity, challenges with daycare or trying to meet their daily needs. They had jobs paying six figures. And so, of course, they're not going to address these things with the sorts of urgency that they needed, because they haven't experienced them, right? This was very clear even just a few weeks ago when Congress, the White House delayed, and then Congress allowed, or they didn't even take a serious effort to extend the eviction moratorium. And, you know, Nancy Pelosi, the day after she recessed the Congress and let them go home, then she declared that the CDC had a moral imperative to do something. And Cori Bush, who 20 years ago had been evicted from her apartment and was living in her car, she joined some other Congress members and camped out in front. They became homeless on the Capitol steps.
That's interesting.
Right? Whereas Nancy Pelosi let everyone go on vacation, just said, well, someone should do something, and it won't be me. And same with Joe Biden, same with the Republicans, right? And so this is where these are the challenges that we have, which is, the people we're being led by have made such a career and have grown so comfortable in their political offices that they've lost touch with the challenges that everyday Americans are facing. And so they don't they don't meet them with the type of urgency that these situations demand.
Yeah, I agree with you. I looked at what kind of houses a lot of these politicians lived in, and some of them were living in gigantic mansions, including Obama and Bernie Sanders and multiple homes, Nancy Pelosi. It's just, they're on both sides,
Donald
Republican
Trump,
and
Mitch
Democrat.
McConnell, Paul Ryan, all of them, they all have become very, very comfortable, right? Again, we tend to just call out the political opponents of what we have, but we have to acknowledge these are bipartisan values, and both parties do this. They work together to maintain the status quo.
Yeah, Newt Gingrich, that's the one I was thinking of on the Republican side too. So.
Yeah.
Yeah, no. Well, so I think we shared your, you guys go ahead, and if you haven't read it yet, get out and read and buy, and maybe go on to that website that I linked in earlier that you can look at. You can get a signed copy of Unsettling Truths with Mark Charles. He's very well spoken, and the book is very well articulated and knowledgeable, and it has a lot of our history and a lot of the things that he's researched you're going to want to learn about, so that you can get into the conversation and make sure that we understand what our past is like, so we don't repeat it in any way. And so I don't know exactly how we could repeat that, but I mean, you know what I'm saying? It's like you need to understand how different people, marginalized groups, are feeling about the rest of the rest of the world. I think that's important. So anything else, any parting shots you want to share?
That's all. Thank you for having me on. It was great to talk with you. I appreciated the chance to engage with your audience. And yeah, I encourage people, follow me on social media, watch my TEDx talk, We the People, the 3 Most Misunderstood Words in U.S. History. And if you'd like to get a signed copy of my book on my website, Wireless Hogan. So thank you very much. It's great to be here with you today.
Oh, thank you. And I haven't seen your TED Talk, and I didn't realize you had one, so I'm definitely going to go watch it. I love TED Talks.
Yeah, yeah. It was a TEDx talk, but it's been put on the TED website. So
great.
If you can find it, it's linked off of my website, but if you just search Mark Charles, We the People, you'll get my TEDx talk. It comes up pretty quickly.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much. I'm going to go ahead and end the broadcast. You guys just remember, whether you eat, drink, or whatever you do, do it all for the glory of God. So thank you.